All right, Parsha Shemos. Um, so it talks about the beginning of the Shibud, the bondage of the Jewish people. Paro, according to the Medrash, the Jewish people wanted to demonstrate their loyalty to Egypt, and Paro took advantage of that loyalty, and he asked them to become involved in projects that were labor projects on behalf of Egypt. And of course, the Jews were the first to offer their help. Paro, the first day, even joined them. And the Jews became impressed, as some Jews today are impressed when Biden goes to Israel on the first day. And because of that, ultimately they became slaves. They became slaves of Paro, like some American Jews become slaves of those who do not have the best interests of the Jewish people. And then Torah tells us how severe that the children were killed, the children were drowned in the Nile. And for some reason, the Jewish people are not yet moved by the tragedy. They always had this idea, in the end, it'll turn out okay. And by Yamas Melech Mitzrayim, and the king of Egypt dies. Vayanchu v'nei Yisrael min avoda. They groaned from their work. V'tal shavas melakim. Their cries went out to God. We will discuss that pasuk at length a little bit later. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu recognized, and he remembered the bris, the covenant with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Moshe, and he commands Moshe to go to Egypt to help redeem the people. Moshe initially is hesitant, and he suggests that somebody else be the shliach. According to our sages, he was suggesting that Aaron HaKohen be the shliach, be the messenger. But ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu accepts the shlichus, accepts the mission of going to Egypt to talk to Paro and to eventually bring the Jewish people out of Egypt and take them in the desert on the trip to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. But Paro, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, initially rejects the plea of Moshe Rabbeinu to let the Jewish people go out for 3 days to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to serve God. He wouldn't let them out even for 3 days. And then Paro makes them, Paro increases. Paro is aggravated, I guess, by the request of the Jewish people to leave his service for 3 days to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the desert, to serve God in the desert. And Paro decides that the situation demands that extra burden be placed on the Jewish people in making the bricks for the work that they're doing. And Paro says, that they have to collect the straw to make the bricks themselves. So he says, let the work be heavier upon the men, and let them do it. Let them not cry out with false words. So the Baal Haturim says that we find this word Baal Yishu, let them not cry out with false words. Yishu is similar. A similar statement is found in Tehillim. Yishu ve'Moshe. They will cry out, but there is none who will save them. That, in other words, so the Baal Haturim says, this teaches a lesson that those who do not have Kavannah, do not have concentration, or do not concentrate their attention during davening, during prayer, but cry out with words of falsity, for in their hearts they do not concentrate on the words, they speak with their mouths. Of them it is said, they will cry out in Tehillim, but there is none who would save them. However, those who concentrate in their hearts on the words they speak with the mouth, of them it said, then you will call and Hashem will respond. You will cry out and he will say, here I am. So what he's saying is that in addition to the simple pshat of the pasuk, in addition to the simple thought that the words of the verse in the Torah express, that Paro was aggravated by their desire and their feeling that possibly they might get a reprieve and that they would be able to go out, take a vacation, if you call it that, for 3 days to serve their God. That hope is a false hope, and they should not express false hopes, and consequently to negate the ability of expressing false hopes. Paro said that we will make their burden greater. They will have to collect straw to make their own bricks. But in addition to that explanation, Paro, it seems, from the way the Baal Haturim is saying it, Paro is saying that when they pray to God, their prayers are false prayers. And we have to understand, what does that mean? That their prayers are false prayers because they don't even, they have no Kavannah. Unless we say that God had Paro say his words that had one meaning, but those words for the Jewish people should have another meaning as well. And we know that the Jewish people already, I don't know if they started praying, we'll get into that, or they were just crying out because of their service, because of their labor. So God, and Paro obviously was aware that they're crying out. And it seems the question is why the Torah says Vayamas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt died. Vayalanchu v'nei Yisrael min avoda. The Jewish people groaned from their work. Seems very odd. Just because the king of Egypt died, so the Jewish people should groan from their work. Somehow, the death of the enslaver Paro, the one who initiated the slavery, caused the burden to be greater on the Jewish people. Till now, they didn't cry out. Why is it that they didn't cry out till now? And why is it that the death of Paro, the death of the original enslaver Paro, somehow forced them to cry out? And according to some opinions, those were words of tefillah, those were words of prayer to God, begging for help. And it's obvious, unfortunately, very often we only turn to God as a last resort. And the Jewish people had this impression that there was a king, Vayokam Melech Chadash. A king arose at the beginning, that caused their enslavement. The king Paro that took control of Egypt, that enslaved them. Asher lo yodas Yosef. He didn't know Yosef. He didn't like Yosef. He made believe that he wasn't aware of Yosef. But they had this false impression that the other Egyptians, perhaps not those in Paro's court, but the other Egyptians remembered Yosef, the one who saved Egypt from hunger. But the only problem is there is this Paro, this Pharaoh. But once this Pharaoh will die, so they will then return to their position of favor, because they believed that many of the other Egyptians really liked them, remembered what the Jewish people did for them, remembered how Yosef, the leader of the Jews and the assistant king of Egypt, saved the people of Egypt from starvation. But Vayamas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died. The Ramban, I think, focuses on this shot, that the king of Egypt died. The Medrash offers other explanations. Vayamas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died. And at best, there was no change in their status. According to others, it seems that things became worse. So they lost all their hope. So long as they saw light, that they imagined light at the end of the tunnel, they did not turn to God. They didn't feel that their situation was so dire that they should turn use such extreme approach, such an extreme approach as praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as begging God for help. But once there was another king, so they Vatal Shavosam Elokim, their cries. Now, whether the cries were an actual tefillah, an actual prayer, or it was just cries of pain from the work, is something that we'll discuss. So so Paro, hearing their cries and perhaps hearing about some of their prayers, began to think that the reason the Jews are supporting Moshe, the reason Moshe came to him to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are not accepting their role as slaves of Egypt. They refuse to recognize that for all eternity, they are the property of Egypt, and they and their children and their children's children, as we say in the Haggadah, would be enslaved in Egypt. And that bothered Paro. So, Divrei Shav. So, Paro, on one hand, was upset about the very fact that they asked him. But the foundation of their request, Paro recognized, was in the fact that they were actually now praying to God, believing that indicated to them that they thought they would be able to relieve themselves from the slavery. It's true. They thought, up till this point, they thought that the slavery would come to an end by itself with the death of the previous Paro. But once he died, Paro felt they should no longer have thoughts that they'll be going out free. They have to accept their position as being slaves. They have to recognize there is no other alternative for them. So with the request that was made of Paro, that infuriated Paro, but the very fact that they cried out to God, the very fact that they prayed, bothered Paro. And so could be what the Baal Haturim means, that they're praying words that are false, because they know very well that they are not going to be redeemed. And it's just false, just to give them something to make believe to themselves that they will not eternally be slaves. But he wanted them to recognize that they are eternal slaves. So Paro was angered not just by the request, but he was angered by the prayer as well. Now we have to understand. Now but in a sense, so that's if it was a message from Paro. But if it was a message from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that was given through the words of Paro, that we have to understand why is it called Divrei Sheker? The prayer is called Divrei Sheker. Okay, the Baal Haturim says they didn't have Kavannah. They didn't have intention. But even if you don't understand the words, even if you don't understand the words of the Tefila is a prayer. Someone who, let's say, we daven in Hebrew, we use Hebrew language. Someone doesn't know one word of Hebrew, but he says the words. He knows how to read. He doesn't understand, but he fulfills the mitzvah Tefila. Of course, he has to have Kavannah. He should try to understand the words in the first bracha. But let's say he's not able to understand it. Would we say that someone who davens without understanding the words, it's Divrei Sheker? It's words, it's false words, chas v'shalom. It's true. Reb Chaim says that there are two Kavannos. There is a Kavannah that I'm standing before God, that I am talking to God. And that, Reb Chaim says, you need throughout the whole davening. Because if you don't understand that you're talking to God, by definition, it's not a prayer. But then there is a requirement that you should try to understand the words, at least in the first bracha. But if you don't understand it, it's still a tefillah, it's still a prayer. It's certainly not false. So why does the Baal Haturim say that the prayers that the Jewish people were saying there were false prayers? How could you say it was false prayers, even if they didn't have intention? Now, the Torah tells us, as I mentioned before, that after Parah died, Ve'yanchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda, the Jewish people groaned from their work. By Yizaku, they cried out. Batal shavasam el elkim, their cries, they cried out, and their cries from the work went up to God. Now, many of them are Farshim, the Sephorna. They say that it really wasn't it wasn't a crying out of prayer. It was crying out from the work. It was groaning, just saying, I can't take this anymore. That type of groaning. Now, however, when you take a look at the Haggadah, the Haggadah cites the Parsha Bikurim with all the drashos of Chazal, and in the Haggadah, we cried out when the Jew brought the Bikurim, brought the first fruits. So he would recite about the whole history of the Avos, of the patriarchs, of the Jewish people going down to Egypt, of how the Jewish people became a great nation in Egypt, and then how they became enslaved, and how they cried out to God, and how God redeemed them. We cried out to God of our ancestors. Vayishma Shemos kolenu, God heard our voice. Vayaras he saw Besamolenu v'Saksenu, he saw our situation, our desperate situation. Vanitzak Elishem. So the drasha, our sages say, Vanitzak Elishem Kevasenu. Where do we see that the Jewish people cried out to God? Moshe Nemar, Vayihi Vayomim Harabim Mahem Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim. The pasuk in this week's Sedra. It was in those many days, and the king of Egypt died. Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda. The Jewish people groaned from their work. Vayizaku, they cried out. V'taz shavasim elikim min avoda. Their cries went up to God from the work. Now, but when the Bikurim, Pasha Bikurim, it says, "By Nisak Elashem Alakei we cried out. We cried out to God." So it clearly was a tefillah. They were clearly davening. How is it that some of the Mefarshim say that when it says in the Sedra Vayishma that Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda v'yizaku. They groaned from the work and they cried out. It doesn't mean they davened. It just means they cried out in pain. But our sages equate this pasuk with the pasuk in the Bikurim, where we say we cried out to God. If we cried out to God, it was a prayer. And the Mefarshim themselves were obviously aware of this problem. And because of this, if you take this, look at the Sforna says that certain individuals cried out to God. But you get the impression from the Sforna, it was only a small group that prayed, but the others just cried out in pain. A small group of individuals, he calls it the tzaddikim, the righteous ones among them. They cried out in prayer. But the others, they just cried out in pain, not necessarily directed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not necessarily directed to God. Just, I can't take this anymore. This is terrible. But it wasn't a crying out in prayer. Now, but when you take Vanitza, but the simple reading of the Parsha Bikurim would seem to indicate otherwise. Because the simple reading of the Parsha Bikurim says, we cried out to God, the God of our ancestors. God heard our voice. He saw our desperate situation. So it seems it wasn't just a small group. It seems like the Jewish people as a people. Vanitzak, we. Does we mean that the tzaddikim cried out? The simple reading of the word cried out to God. The simple reading is we, the overwhelming majority of the people. When we say we, it doesn't seem to mean just the righteous people, a small group of individuals. So how is it that some of the Mefarshim explain that there was a small group that cried out to God, the others just cried out in pain? How are we to understand this? Now, there is a machlokus. There is a dispute. And I've mentioned it a number of times. There is a machlokus, a dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban about the mitzvah of davening. The Rambam Shita is a Jew is required biblically, Midiaraisa, to daven once a day, but every day. The Chachamim, the sages, instituted an obligation to daven 3 times during the day: Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. However, biblically, the Rambam Shita is that a person is required to daven once a day. The Ramban says that biblically there is no requirement to daven under normal circumstances. The Chachamim, the sages, instituted that you're required to daven 3 times a day. Of course, the Ramban admits that if one wants to ask for help from God, he fulfills a mitzvah of Tefila. He fulfills a mitzvah, but it's not a requirement. But the Ramban seems to indicate that there will be a mitzvah of crying out to God in time of trouble. When there's a war at the borders, when there's famine in the land, when there's pestilence. So in time of trouble, the Ramban admits there's a requirement to daven. And I heard from my father, and I saw the same thing in the notes of my uncle's shiurim, that both the Rambam and the Ramban agree that the mitzvah of davening, the requirement to daven, to pray, is based on the recognition of tzara, based on recognition that we're in trouble, that we need divine help. Except the Rambam opinion is that man is always in trouble. We might not recognize what the trouble is. Sometimes, I've mentioned many times, that the Holocaust, the attitudes, almost overnight changed. I mentioned that on October 7th, with the incident of October 7th, I got calls, people talked to me, people who are not observant, people who are not necessarily shomer mitzvahs, some who halachically might not even be considered Jewish, but have associations with the Jewish faith and are identified by others as being Jewish, that all of a sudden the people that were their friends turned against them overnight. So the day before, they had no inkling that something like that would happen or even could happen. They were expressing their surprise. They didn't know how to understand it. So we're always in trouble. It's just that we don't always recognize the trouble. And we know that in Israel, whatever the reason is, and whoever's fault it is, the Jews were not prepared. Perhaps they should have been prepared. And on a personal level, very often we're in trouble. We're in trouble even before we know it. We know Jews are attacked. Not just Jews, Gentiles today, walking the streets. A short time ago, there was never this. It was, I wouldn't say it was 100% safe, but people can't even go in the subways today without being attacked, without the fear of being attacked. A short while ago, when I was a young boy in elementary school, we used to go to yeshiva by subway. Today, as an adult, I wouldn't use the subway. At any moment, you never know what could happen. And there are people who feel safe going on the subway. But those are the ones who are very often are attacked. So even though we do not see the danger, man, and it's not just the Jew, those who are attacked on the subways, And not only Jews, of course, the Jews are sort of very often the favorite target. But every human being is in danger, but we don't recognize the danger. The Rambam's opinion is that the mitzvah of tefillah, the mitzvah of davening every day, is because we recognize that we're always in danger. Even if you don't recognize what the danger is, you have to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Davening, praying, is a response to the recognition of the fact that we are always in danger. And the Ramban's opinion is, the Ramban also does not disagree with the Rambam. The Ramban's opinion is that, yes, man is always in danger, but the requirement to daven is only when you recognize what the danger is. Now, it's very interesting. The Reb Chaim says that even according to the Ramban, that on a biblical level, you're not required to daven every day. It's only rabbinic that makes you required to daven every day, 3 times a day. But on a biblical level, you're not even required under normal circumstances to daven once a day. And only when you recognize that you're in danger are you required to daven. Reb Chaim said, nevertheless, anytime you daven, even though it's not required, even the Ramban admits you fulfill a mitzvah of davening. And the question is, what mitzvah are you fulfilling? Years ago, I remember Rabbi Wernick, who was the mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College just before we moved to Chicago. He came to visit my father in New York, and I was standing by the door listening to the conversation. And Rabbi Wernick asked that question to my father, and he suggested an answer. Rabbi Wernick was a big Baal Musar, a great Baal Musar, I should say. And he suggested an answer that is indicative of the approach of someone who is involved, very much involved in the study of Musar. He says, when you daven, and to a certain degree, while it's indicative of a Baal Musar, it was indicative of Rabbi Wernick himself. He says, when you're davening, you fulfill the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, of love of God, and the fear of God. Because davening is coming close to God, but also recognizing the awe of God. So it's expressive of love of God, which is a mitzvah, and fear of God, which is a mitzvah. My father said that according to the Ramban, he holds that it comes within the mitzvah of Avadatem, you shall serve God. But the Tefila part of Avadatem, of serving God, that's not a general requirement, but you fulfill serving God through davening. So you fulfill the mitzvah, the voluntary mitzvah of Avadatem, the voluntary aspects of the mitzvah of Avadatem, of serving God. I think there's another answer. Because the Ramban pointed out that there possibly would be a requirement of davening in time of trouble. When we're attacked, as we were on October 7th, when there is war, when there is famine, when there is pestilence. In time of trouble, we recognize the trouble is a requirement to daven. But the Ramban agrees with the Rambam that recognition of the trouble, that man is always in trouble. Consequently, you're not required to daven because you don't recognize what the trouble is. But the mitzvah of davening in time of trouble, the requirement to daven in time of trouble, according to the Ramban, is included the mitzvah of chatzotzros, of blowing the trumpets. The trumpets were blown in time of trouble. The trumpets, in a sense, represent the cry of the Jewish nation to God. It's the sounds that we have with the shofar, Kia, Trua, Shvarim, Trua. These are identified as sounds of crying to God. So even when we don't recognize the trouble, we're not required. And perhaps there is no mitzvah to blow the trumpets, which is indicative of the cry of the Jewish people. But included in that mitzvah, according to the Ramban, is the mitzvah of davening. Davening, even when it's not required, but it's done with the recognition that we're in trouble, is fulfilling that mitzvah that's included in the chatzotros of davening because of trouble. It's required when we recognize the trouble, but if we don't recognize the trouble, it's still a tefillah. We fulfill a mitzvah, a biblical mitzvah of crying out to God because we recognize that we're in trouble, even though we don't recognize what the trouble is. And so now there is a very interesting Mishkenes Yaakov. The Mishkenes Yaakov, by the way, the Mishkenes Yaakov was was considered the outstanding Talmud, the outstanding student of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. I'm not talking about his son Rav Itzela, who succeeded him, but among the students, the Mishkenes Yaakov, who, by the way, was the brother of the Karanora and the Rebbe of the Karanora, was the outstanding student of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And when he wrote Shuvas as a young person, and he showed them to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, and where he disagreed with people who were considered great poskim of the generation, Reb Chaim Volozhiner said about his tshuvos that he wrote like he was one of the Gdolei Hador, one of the greatest of that generation. And that was expressed by Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And you have to understand, at that time, someone left money to the Gadol Hador, and he didn't say who the Gadol Hador was. So, but at that time, the perception was, at least in that part of Europe, that the three that were considered the greatest at that time were the Nesivos, also the Rabbi Kiva and Reb Chaim Volozhiner. In Hungary, they probably would have suggested the Chassam Sofer also, but I don't know if Hungary was included in this will. So the Nesivos and Rabbi Kiva both paskind that the Gadol Hador was Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And it was Reb Chaim Volozhiner who said about the Mishkenes Yaakov when he was a young man, was like one of the Dole Hador. And I heard said over in my uncle's name, I didn't hear it from him. I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard said over that he felt that some of the tshuvos in the Mishkenes Yaakov were written like he was a Rishon. Didn't say that about every tshuva. And it's brought down that Reb Chaim, my great-grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker, he said about the Mishkenes Yaakov that in every tshuva that he wrote, Kol HaTorah Kula went through his mind when he wrote that tshuva. Not just all the Gemaras and all the Rishonim and all the Poskim and the Zohar and all the Medrashim. When he wrote a tshuva, it all went through his mind. He was, by the way, the Mishkenes Yaakov and the Karanora were both the great nephews of the Shagasaryeh. So the Mishkenes Yaakov says something very interesting. There's a question. The Rambam's opinion is that davening is a mitzvah d'oraisa every day. The Ramban disagrees. It's not a requirement. You fulfill a mitzvah, as I've discussed. But everybody raises a question against the Rambam because the Gemara constantly refers to Tefila, to davening, refers to davening as a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Kriya Shema, not that there isn't an opinion that it's the Eraisa. Of course, certainly the overwhelming opinion is that Shema is the Eraisa. But when it comes to Tefillah, the Gemara consistently says that Tefillah is a mitzvah Rabbanan, is a rabbinic mitzvah. So the question is, how is it that the Rambam says that the requirement to daven at least once every day is a mitzvah d'oraisa? And the Mishkenes Yaakov suggests something. If it wasn't the Mishkenes Yaakov, one would wonder about it. But the Mishkenes Yaakov says that under many circumstances, when a person is preoccupied and he's not able to daven, he fulfills the mitzvah of davening with the tzibur. When you have a group in the community that davens, a similar thing is mentioned in regard to Birchas Kahanim, about getting the blessing of the Kohanim. There are circumstances when a person is not able to be present, he's preoccupied. He's not able to be present when the Birchas Kahanim, the blessing of the Kohanim, takes place. Nevertheless, he is affected by the Amsha Besados, the people that work in the field. They share in the blessing given by the Kohanim. And the Mishkenes Yaakov suggests the same thing is true about davening. In other words, if in the community there are many people, there is a group of people, there is a tzibur, the tzibur of the community. There is a minyan of the community that davens. So those who are not able to participate in the tefillah, the biblical mitzvah of tefillah, they fulfill. It's very strange. I always had trouble with this Mishkenes Yaakov. I'm working in the fields, and a minyan is davening, and I fulfill the mitzvah tefillah. Okay, you could say the community fulfills the mitzvah tefillah, but how are we to understand it? That even those that are not davening, those that are planting, are fulfilling the mitzvah tefillah of davening on a biblical level. How are we to understand it? So the Mishkan Yaakov, and so what I wanted to suggest that when the community, well, it's a community mitzvah. The community davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But for me to be a beneficiary of that tefillah, to have that tefillah attributed to me, it's necessary for me to recognize that I am b'tzara, that I am in danger. Because if I do not recognize that I am in danger, that tefillah is no tefillah. It can't be attributed to me. And I want to suggest that perhaps when the Torah says, Vayenchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda, and the Sephorna says that only a small group, davened, but the Birkas Kahanim, it says, "Vanitzak el Hashem Elokei Avoseinu." We cried, not just the small group. So, in other words, the tefillah of the small group is my tefillah also. It was my davening also. But it's only my davening if I recognize that I'm in trouble. But if I don't recognize that I'm in trouble, then that tefillah is not connected to me at all. And I think that's how we can understand it. Their cries went up to God, even though they didn't pray. Among them that prayed. So because they reckoned by crying out, it was indicative of the fact that they no longer saw that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And once they recognized there was no light at the end of the tunnel, the prayer that the tzaddikim, the righteous ones, small as the group might have been, was attributed to the rest of the Jewish people as well. So therefore we could say, by Yitzhaku, that they all, Vanitzak el Hashem Elokei Avoseinu, we cried out to the God of our ancestors, and Vatal Shabbat, because of the tefillah of the few and the shavasim of everybody. Everybody recognized there's no light at the end of the tunnel. They now recognize they have to turn to God. And this is where the whole episode of Yetzias Mitzrayim begins. Up till this point, up till they recognized they had their dependency on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. Things begin to change. God appears to Moshe only after the Tefillah, only after the Jewish people recognized the nature of their danger, the nature of their trouble. And this I think is, yes, you don't need Kavannah of Perish Hamilim. You don't need to understand the words of the davening. And Reb Chaim says you have to know, though, that you're standing before God. Because if you don't know that you're standing before God, you're talking to the wall. It's not a prayer. Even if you don't understand the words, it's a prayer. But if you don't realize that you're talking to God, it's not a prayer. It's talking to the wall. But it's not enough to realize you're talking to God. You have to realize you're talking to God and asking Him for help for your troubles. For your troubles. So the Kavannah here, when you daven as an individual, even if you don't understand the words of the davening, but you recognize that you're in trouble. And certainly when you recognize what the trouble is, but you don't understand the words themselves, that tefillah is okay. And when there's a group that's davening, even if for some reason you're not able to join them, you're out on the fields, you don't have the opportunity to daven, you're a slave, and the slave masters do not let you daven. Paro does not look favorably on the davening. But if you cry out for help, that shows that you recognize you're in trouble. So the davening of the tzaddikim, those people who are able to daven, let it be Shevet Levi, who was not in bondage. The prayer of that group, who daven as a group, if I cry out for help, if I cry out, if I moan, I recognize that I'm in trouble, the prayer is attributed to me as well. So Kavannah doesn't necessarily mean understanding the words. Kavannah means to understand that I'm in trouble. And it's at this point that the Jewish recognize our dependency upon God. It's only at this point that the Jewish people began to recognize their dependency upon God. So Paro, of course, he considered praying to be a false hope for the Jewish people. But the Jewish people, and he wanted them just to accept what it is. But the Jewish people, when they cried out, they recognized they were in trouble. Because they recognized they're in trouble, the prayer. So those who, even if they didn't understand the words, and even if they didn't daven, but there was a group that was davening for them, that prayer would be attributed to them as well. This is the way we could understand the Baal Haturim. In other words, even if you don't understand the words, but you recognize you're in trouble, you recognize that you need the help of God, then the prayer is attributed to you as well. And I just want to mention in Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov is scared, he's fearful because Esav is coming to meet him. And our sages tell us that Yaakov prepared l'duran, l'tefila, l'mulchama. Duran means he sent him a present. We know the messengers that Yaakov sent, whether they were real messengers or malachim, whatever it is, they brought a present of cattle and everything to Esav. Tefila, Yaakov daven, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav. And he prepared himself for war, for fighting also. And the question is, Yaakov Avinu, prayer is the second thing. He tries to bribe Esav. He sends him a present, then prayer, and then war. How are we to understand it? It's very strange. I would have thought that Yaakov Avinu would do prayer first, and if prayer doesn't work, that would be difficult also. But why is it l'duran, l'tefila, l'mulchama? But I think Torah, the Medrash here is telling us that yes, prayer is very important, but you can't rely on prayer alone. By those Yashir, Matitzak Elai, Daber El B'nei Yisrael B'Yisrael. Yes, it was prayed for Yitzhak, who is mentioned by those Yashir. Vayitzaku is mentioned by Daz Yashir. The Jewish people saw Egypt running after them. And on one side it was the Egyptians, the Egyptian army, and the other side was the Yam, was the sea. And they cried out to God. And at a certain point, and Moshe cried out to God. And God tells Moshe, you can't just rely on crying out to God. Yes, it's important, but we have to cry out to God that our effort should be successful. When it says Durin Ulutfilo Mulchama, it's combined. The Durin has to come with Tefila. We have to pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that our effort should be successful. He knew that Esav had decided that he wanted to kill him. So he knew that he has to couple his tefillah to Durin Ula tefillah. The Durin has to come together with the tefillah. The tefillah has to be that the Durin should be successful. And of course, when we'll come afterwards, whatever efforts I'm doing, the tefillah has to be, the davening has to be, whatever I do should be successful. But you have to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu that it should be successful. It's not going to be successful without it. And again, I speak every week about the situation in Eretz Yisrael. And there are those who say that they just have to daven and they have to learn. I'm not getting into that argument now. And it might be a situational argument, depending on the situation, depending on the person, depending on the need that there might be. But so they say they're davening, they're learning. But they have to understand, even if they're davening and they're learning, the davening has to be that the soldiers will be successful. They can't just have this idea that because I davened, I have nothing to worry about. Their davening has to accompany, come together with the fighting of the soldiers. If they say we're not in danger, then their davening is something separate. It has to be l'durin u'letfila. Durin would be diplomacy. There is diplomacy going on constantly now. And there's war going on constantly. But both of them need tefillah. Tefillah is placed in the middle because all of them require tefillah. You shouldn't think that the tefillah is something separate. So l'durin u'letfila u'lemuchama means that you need, whatever you do requires tefillah. You need a prayer to help. But you can't think that the tefillah by itself, you could hope, but you can't feel assured that the tefillah by itself, there comes a point, daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yisrael. The Jewish people have to do something else. Don't say you don't need the soldiers. You need the soldiers for your tefillah to be worthwhile. If you don't recognize you're in sorrow, then your tefillah isn't worth anything. This is the idea of recognition of tzara. The essence of tefillah is a response to tzara. If you think you're not in tzara, you are not davening. You're talking to the wall. And I want to suggest one other thing. It's possible. The pasuk says, I cried out. We cried out to the God of our fathers, and And it's Vayiskar Elokim es Briso, that's in the Parsha Bikurim. Now, in our Parsha, God remembered his covenant as Avram, as Yitzchak, as Yaakov. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I think it's more than just a prayer. It's more than just the bris, the covenant. In other words, the Jewish people were slaves. And there is a halacha. Of course, this did not apply to the Jewish people at that time. But there is a halacha that an eved ein lo yichus. An eved does not have yichus. His children are not considered his children. And why is there such halacha? Because in those days, in ancient times, a slave was sold. You were born to your mother, and 5 days later, she could have been sold to a different master. There was no connection. So the halacha that Eved Ein Lo Yichus was expressive of what the facts were. And in a sense, when you perceive yourself as a slave, when the Jews perceived themselves as slaves in Egypt, even when they thought they might eventually come free by themselves, but at that moment they were slaves. There was something lacking in their mind, in the connection between Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and themselves. There was something missing in the pedigree, because slaves do not identify with the former generations. The slave only has a now. He doesn't have a connection with the former generations. A slave doesn't have a connection with the future generations. But Tefila davening was Shacharis, was Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Rashi by the Oz Yashir, when the Jewish people saw Paro and his army running after them, they cried out to God. And Rashi tells us that they employed the methods, the skills, the job of their ancestors, of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram tikein tefillah shacharis. Yitzchak tikein tefillah mincha. Yaakov tikein tefillah ma'ariv. In a sense, by davening, they were not only recognizing they were in trouble, they were not only praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but they were also identifying with the Yavos. They were doing what the patriarchs did by davening and doing what the patriarchs, following the example of the patriarchs to a certain degree, whereas Paro was trying to maximize their perspective of being slaves. By davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they were limiting that perspective. They were identifying with the Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They were saying, we have a pedigree. We identify with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Generally, slaves have no future, have no past, they have no pedigree. It was a fact in ancient times. And the halacha, and there is a halacha to that effect based on what the facts were. But by davening and to God, the God of their ancestors, so they were saying, we are limiting our self-perspective as a slave. We are identifying with our ancestors. We have a connection to them. They are our ancestors, and we're not going to be the same slaves that we were previously. Okay.
Any questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, this is from. Well, why don't we blow shofar more on a regular basis? Someone heard that Rav Moshe Sternbach has a shofar blown and he davens with Avinu Malkeinu.
I guess that it's the blowing of shofar uh, is indicative of the fact that we're in trouble. Also, Rosh Hashanah, we know that we're bedin, and we're in din also, and to a certain degree, the sound of a shofar halachically not, except on Rosh Hashanah, but the Mitzias shofar is identified with tefillah. You see that we blow the shofar during the Musaf prayer, so it's part and parcel. It's part and parcel of the prayer. So it's a form. It's crying out, as I said, Kia Trua Shvarm Trua Shvarm Trua. These are all sounds of crying, and we're crying out to God because of the situation that we find ourselves in. So while you might not fulfill the mitzvah of crying out to God, it's certainly a recognition. It's expressive, as I mentioned in this year now, it's expressive of recognizing that we are in trouble. But in addition to that, it might be a tefillah, even though it's not the mitzvah of tefillah. It might be a prayer, but it's not the mitzvah of davening. But in Rosh Hashanah, it's part and parcel of the mitzvah of davening.
Um, Sometimes isn't there a basis for tefillah just for like halal of gratitude?
Halal is not prayer. Halal is halal. Halal is thanks, primarily thanks. Whereas prayer is we're in trouble. Halal has validity. There is one opinion, since you mentioned Rabbeinu Avram ben Rambam. He says that if halal would be a mitzvah d'oraisa, which he disagrees with, he says, but it would be a partial fulfillment of prayer, but not a complete fulfillment of prayer. But that's then the halal has to be based on recognition of the fact that we were in trouble and God took us out of trouble.
I guess this is related to what you mentioned from the Mishkanos Yaakov about where the people who were
Yeah,
working in the fields they were able to be yotze with
yeah, right.
Tul Tibor. Nowadays, people who don't prioritize davening with the tzibor, can it be considered that they're davening with the tzibor?
You mean on a derisive level? If they, if my sense is, what do you mean by prior Torah?
Prioritizing.
What does that mean?
They know how to daven, but it's not that important to them.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay.
Priority.
Yeah, I say okay. Priority. I see. The if I I don't know. I would assume that if they're just doing without any reason, then the Mishkan Yaakov might not apply. But the people at that time, they were in the fields. They were enslaved. They just didn't have that ability to daven.
This is, I think it's a very important point that this person is asking. It's not exactly related to I mean, it's related to ideas in the share, but what about for people who don't necessarily feel that Hashem listens when they talk? They don't have the right relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, but they still uh daven. Are those tefillos effective
Okay,
without
so
having proper kavana
the simple
completely?
reading of Reb Chaim would indicate. Do they realize they're talking to God?
They know that they're supposed to be talking to Hashem, but they're not sure that it actually works, but they're daven anyway.
Uh-huh. As they say, if you're listening, God, this is what I'm saying. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. I think that's what this question was.
Huh? Okay, it's hard for me to say, but I would
Yes, yes, that
assume,
is that is the question. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, my assumption is that when it comes to that, you have to realize that you're talking to God. You have to realize that you're talking to God, and if you don't believe that you're talking to God, it's not a tefillah. Oh, but you're talking about people, but you're talking to people who are davening. Yeah,
Yeah, people
so
who are davening,
davening. So it's interesting. The same question was asked of Brisker Rav. A little different, but more or less the same question. People asked the Brisker Rav if they daven without Kavannah of Omed Lefnei Hashchina, based on what Reb Chaim says, maybe they shouldn't daven. And the Brisker Rav said they should daven, but he didn't answer them according to Reb Chaim Brisker. He answered them according to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, because Reb Chaim Volozhiner says that if a person davens without kavana, that's like carbon menachos. But if a person davens with kavana, then it's like giving an animal carbon, and rather than a flower carbon. You understand? He equates kavana, a kavana. He equates davening without kavana as giving a certain type of carbon, whereas with kavana, it's giving a carbon of giving minatzonim and a bakar, as we say in Vayikra. But there are karbanos menachos of flour and this. That's how he equates tefillah without davening. Now, that's not something that has any basis that I see in the Chidusha Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi, but that's what Reb Chaim Volozhiner said. So when people would ask the Brisker Rav about the Reb Chaim in the Sefer on the Rambam, he would answer them with what Reb Chaim Volozhiner says in the Nefesh HaChaim. So that's the only thing is, you do see, let's say, if somebody is Bob Baderech, it doesn't apply today. In those days, when you came from the road and you couldn't have Kavannah for a certain amount of time, the Gemara in Bracha says that you don't daven because you're not going to have Kavannah. It could be that because that Reb Chaim Volozhiner felt that in a situation where where we live today, that if you don't daven, when you don't have kavana, people would hardly ever daven. And we could suggest that perhaps I have trouble with it, that if you recognize you're in trouble and you end with the Mishkanas Yaakov, so when you daven without kavana, but there could perhaps be a tziruf, a connection between the tefillas of the community together with your tefillah if they're davening with kavana, perhaps. That's according to the Mishkanas Yaakov. Reb Chaim in the Sefer doesn't mention the Mishkanas Yaakov on this issue, but that's what the Brisker Rav would say. It's like a mincha. Understand? It's like carbon mincha.
So then, someone else asked, there are many today who sooner escape than recognize that they're in trouble and don't know they're talking to Hashem, but still go through the motions. So this is people who know that they're in trouble,
Yeah,
and daven, even though they don't necessarily think they're speaking to Hashem.
So my guess is that that was the same question as the previous question.
Yeah.
Again, I can tell you what the Brisker Rav said. I can perhaps attach it to the Mishkanas Yaakov, perhaps, because it's a tzibur tefillah. You understand? So with my tefillah, I joined the tzibur. But let's say there wouldn't be in an area where there is no tefillah. no tzibur davening, it could be it won't work. Could be it won't work.
So then someone else asks a good point. What about mitoch shalolishma bolishma, doing something not for the right reason because eventually do for the right reason? What about for that in terms of davening? People, I guess, not davening with proper kavana, with the hope that they will eventually get to daven with.
I guess if you rely on the Reb Chaim Volozhiner or that other svara that I said, then it's the big issue is, will it be a bracha of? That's the big question. So it could be that if a person, again, it could be that the Reb Chaim Volozhiner said it because in regard to a situation where people will never have kavana unless they start. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there you can rely on the fact that it's like menachos, or say that you're doing it together with the tzibur. But clearly, according to the simple reading of Reb Chaim, it would seem that you're not Yotzei Mitzvah. But clearly, the custom is not in accordance with what Reb Chaim said. And now the Chazon Ish, there are those who suggest that Reb Chaim meant to say that, well, I don't know if you want to say that. Okay. According to the simple reading of Reb Chaim, it seems that wouldn't be applicable, but there are other opinions, and certainly where the alternative will be that you'll hardly ever daven, you should rely on those other opinions. That's probably what the Brisker meant.
Is there a way to describe Reb Chaim Volozhiner's answer in simple terms to be mechazik people?
Yes, that when you have Kavannah, it's like giving yourself over. In other words, because the animal has a nefesh, and you're giving, and it has blood. So it's the idea of giving yourself. The hevel hevi gam hu mepchoros sono. As a matter of fact, we could suggest that was part of the idea, the difference between the carbon of Cain. I'm thinking as I'm talking. The carbon of Cain was an animal carbon that was indicative of the fact that Hevel saw himself giving himself over because it was a living thing that he was giving over to God. Whereas Cain gave from a pre-Hadama nothing that he could identify with. He could identify with the work. He was giving the fruit to God, but not giving himself over to God. So that's how we could understand it. In other words, the hevi gamhu, the giving over of oneself, that is only accomplished through the giving over of an animal, something that has a nefesh. But if you give over something that grows, that's not hevi gamhu. You're not giving yourself over. You're giving something. You're giving over something that you possess.
Okay, thank you very much. So, everyone have a good week. No other questions.